I'm very pleased to be here with you all, really. I've wanted to come to Malaysia for years. The dear National Assembly has been inviting me several times and it hadn't worked out, and this time it has. And I want to express my appreciation to the National Assembly for the opportunity to come here and experience fellowship with the Baha'is, really, of Southeast Asia. So many of you are here from all around. We used to be, I hadn't been in this area, but serving in the World Center on the Teaching Center on the House of Justice, we used to be thrilled with the news from Malaysia all the time. It was one of the places we didn't worry about. Maybe we should have, but we weren't worrying about it at that time. And now look at how it's grown and how you are here. You know, Shoghi Effendi said that these gatherings where so many friends come together, it attracts the blessings of the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit hovers over this meeting. The Guardian used to say that to the friends too. He said that when you're gathered, the central figures from on high are observing you, watching and sending their blessings on us. We have this wonderful opportunity. We talk about love. We have this particular occasion to express it to each other. The theme about the dispensation of the Bab, we really should be very grateful to Councillor Tehrani for this review of the life of the Bab and the meaning of his sacrifice and his martyrdom and the example of Anis. And I had anticipated that people would probably be speaking about this history. So I thought, well, what aspect should I introduce for us to think about and to reflect on? And apart from these marvelous, inspiring episodes that we need to absorb and, if you will, bring into our bloodstream, into our nervous system, there are aspects which assist us in recognizing the Bab at this bicentenary of his birth that we may not have all thought about recently. Though the friends who have been students of the writings will be familiar with all these things, but this is a kind of a review which will help us to look at the Bab from different aspects. For instance, I've collected some comments and thoughts from particularly the vision of the Guardian of the history of the faith to share here today. I need to put out a clock here, something to keep track of how long I'm speaking. Thank you. First of all, we have the question of his mission. How do we summarize the mission of the Bab in very few words? This is always our challenge. We don't have a lot of time to talk to people. We want to get what's important into what we say or what we think when we reflect, when we remember the Bab, when we think of the Bab. How do we express the whole mission of the Bab in one or two short paragraphs? Then we have the question of his person. What was the Bab like? How can we express to people something of the characteristics of the person of the Bab? Then we have an overview of his ministry. This is a sweep. And we have the marvelous contributions of Shoghi Effendi summarizing and listing the different episodes of and importance of the events of the heroic age of the faith. Finally, we have a question of his writings, brief look at that, which are the most important ones of them, what was their central purpose, That, of course, includes his covenant, binding us to the appearance of him whom God shall make manifest. And finally, we have a characterization of his rank, his position in the spiritual evolution of mankind. In all of this, I've always felt guided by the writings of Shoghi Effendi. Now, Shoghi Effendi, as you know, he edited and translated the Dawnbreakers. So he's really the source of this gift that we have of the history of the Bab. And then, for that work, he read a lot of non-Baha'i literature by people who weren't believers, observers, European historians. Nicola, Gobineau, Brown, marvelous scholars who, in a sense, legitimized for scholarship these episodes of the life of the Bab. It's so marvelous that we have that. And Shoghi Effendi put them as footnotes. He developed and himself placed footnotes in his edited version of Nabiul's narrative. So those are very interesting to go back and look at too. Many of them are in French. One of the believers in America years ago dedicated themselves to translating the French footnotes in the Dawnbreakers, and that's published separately. So if you're not familiar with French, you can find them there. And they make a marvelous contribution to an outside view, if you will, of the Bab and his mission. To give us an example of how Shoghi Effendi would summarize the most important points when he was describing some aspect of the faith, or the faith itself in a whole. We have two documents that Shoghi Effendi prepared. One was prepared for the High Commissioner of Palestine early on in 1933. Shoghi Effendi was writing to him. The municipality of Haifa was wanting to build a road directly in front of the Shrine of the Bab, which would have become a traffic road of traffic, and Shoghi Effendi was pressed to bring to the attention of the High Commissioner, the highest authority in the land, the sacredness of the site of the Bab. So he had to summarize the coming of the Bab, who the Bab was, and what the Shrine of the Bab meant to a world of followers of the Bab and his faith throughout the world. Needless to say, his intention in preparing this document was fully confirmed by God, and the government didn't build a road in front of the Shrine of the Bab. We have the path of the pilgrims instead, and that's quite appropriate. So he opens, he says, the forerunner of the faith, he's talked to him about that, he wants to describe the faith. He said, the forerunner of the faith was Mirza Ali Muhammad of Shiraz, known as the Bab, the Gate, who proclaimed on May 23, 1844, his twofold mission as an independent manifestation of God and herald of one greater than himself, who would inaugurate a new and unprecedented era in the religious history of mankind. Seems to me, friends, in any presentation that we make, we want to get these points across if we're going to describe something about the Bab's mission. He was the forerunner of the faith, he was the Bab, and he proclaimed a twofold mission. Do you remember now what the twofold mission is? Independent manifestation of God, herald of one greater than himself. This is an introduction way back in 33, before the Dawnbreakers was translated, before we had God Passes By with its fuller explanation, before Shoghi Effendi's magisterial letter, the Dispensation of Baha'u'llah, where he defines in great detail the independent manifestation of the Bab and also his role as herald of one greater than himself. So these are some preliminary points. Again, Shoghi Effendi was asked by the United Nations, who was looking into the status of the condition of Palestine, thank you, as the state of Israel was being contemplated, what was the role of the different religions in the country? And the commission of scholars that prepared this for the United Nations met in Haifa, and they had to ask Shoghi Effendi if he would state what the role of the Baha'i faith in the Holy Land was. What a brilliant moment, really, for us. And Shoghi Effendi has prepared a statement that in its succinctness and in its accuracy can't be compared with anything else that we have. He starts this statement, which has been published in Baha'i World books in the past. You can find it in separate editions also. He says the Baha'i faith revolves around three central figures, the first of whom was a youth, a native of Shiraz, known as Mirza Ali Muhammad, known as the Bab, who in May 1844, at the age of 25, advanced the claim of being the herald who, according to the sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself, whose mission would be, according to those same scriptures, to inaugurate an era of righteousness and peace. All right, friends, we read that. What can we capture? What should we hold from this that we can use in our statements? I think different of us might focus on different things. A herald who, according to sacred scriptures of previous dispensations, must needs announce and prepare the way for the advent of one greater than himself, but also that he's to inaugurate an era of righteousness and peace. How do we characterize the future Baha'i era? What are the words we should choose? Here we have an example in Shoghi Effendi, an era of righteousness and peace. That's what we're working for. That is what we're working for. An era, he goes on to state, that would be hailed as the consummation of all previous dispensations and initiate a new cycle in the religious history of mankind. Oh, friends, how much of our Baha'i teachings line up under these 2 points? The consummation of all previous dispensations. What marvelous statements we have from Baha'u'llah, how the faith itself is all the truths, all the beauty of past dispensations has been renewed, refreshed, and set forth in the scriptures of our faith. And now we're into a cycle of fulfillment rather than a cycle of prophecies. And look at this is the room of the fulfillment of those prophecies. Amazing. This is a message that was written by Shoghi Effendi in 1947. We come to the question of the person of the Bab. Of course, we would all, I think, describe with love and with whatever vision we've derived if we've read carefully the Dawnbreakers. How does Shoghi Effendi, when he wishes to set forth and characterize the person of the Bab, what attributes does he mention? Friends, I'm going to read you two sets of them. One is from God Passes By, the foreword of God Passes By, and the other is from the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. They're parallel with each other, but slightly different in their order and emphasis. It seems to me if we want to talk, we want to describe the Bab, we need to focus on these characterizations, along with whatever we have absorbed of the history of the faith, to be able to speak about it. Look how the vision of the Bab comes forward from these few phrases. He's describing the first of the four periods which he surveys and reviews in God Passes By, in the foreword to God Passes By. And he says that this first period, which is 1844 to 1853, and which constitutes the first quarter of the book God Passes By, centers around the gentle, the youthful, and irresistible person of the Bab. Gentle, youthful, irresistible. Matchless in his meekness. Imperturbable in his serenity. Magnetic in his utterance. And unrivaled in the dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry. You can line up so many different stories. You could put these as the title of different sections of a booklet and line up the episodes that demonstrate the irresistible character of the Bab, his meekness, his serenity, the matchless and magnetic utterances that he spoke and how they affected the people that heard him. Prior to that, earlier on, Shoghi Effendi, in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, paints for us a picture of what he calls the supreme theophany. It's written on the 90th anniversary of the founding of the faith. Interestingly enough, Shoghi Effendi in 1944, celebrating the centenary of the founding of the faith, his emphasis is on the founding of the faith and not on the 100th anniversary of the declaration of the Bab, although it's implicit in it. He calls that anniversary not the anniversary of the declaration of the Bab, but the founding of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Some scholars later said, but this was the faith of the Bab. Why does he include the Bab with Baha'u'llah? You can see, friends, from these explanations of the Guardian and from the writings that he cites in support of this, that it's one faith we have. And one of the great features, which we'll mention a bit in more detail later, is that the Bab reigns together with Baha'u'llah over the destinies of our faith. And that this is unique in all of recorded religious history. From the Muslim point of view, from the teachings of the Quran, we understand that John the Baptist was a messenger of God. He brought laws, he brought teachings. He heralded the coming of the Christ. He baptized the Christ. But no, there's no indication, nor is it repeated in Christianity, that he reigns together with the Christ over the Christian dispensation. What an amazing opening dispensation of a 500,000-year cycle, the Baha'i cycle proclaimed by the cause. What an amazing thing that this opening dispensation, and then through future history, the Bab reigns together with Baha'u'llah. Now, how does Shoghi Effendi describe that connection? It's very interesting. How do you get two manifestations, two independent shining of light? You know, they're in the skies, there are some stars that are twin stars. They have two stars both shining on the planets that are circling around them. Quite interesting. In every case, as I understand it from the science that's available to us, one of those stars is fixed. It doesn't move. It's the center. And the second star revolves around it. This makes for very interesting multicolored shadows of the people living on those planets. We have this multicolored spiritual inheritance because we have the Bab shining on us and Baha'u'llah shining on us. Two independent sources of revelation. So quite, Shoghi Effendi says this is the supreme feature, the special characteristic of this dispensation. Shoghi Effendi talks right away in the opening phrases where he's describing Baha'u'llah. And by the way, go look and see how Baha'u'llah is described in this same way with a few short, terse phrases, very meaningful. He says, the Bab allied those subordinate in rank and invested with the authority of presiding with him over the destinies of this supreme dispensation. There shines upon this mental picture, which he's painting for us, the youthful glory of the Bab, infinite in his tenderness, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, matchless in the dramatic circumstances of his short yet eventful life. You find that published in the World Order of Baha'u'llah Letters. The message that's been entitled The Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. When I became a Baha'i back in the 1950s, while Shoghi Effendi was still alive, one of the prerequisites to become a member of the Baha'i community was to study the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, this letter, and the Will and Testament of Abdul-Baha, and Baha'u'llah in the New Era, and write an essay why you believe in Baha'u'llah, which the local assembly would then study and decide whether you could become a Baha'i or not. They took a long time deciding about me, I can tell you. Friends, the administration has its ups and downs, you know. I met a local assembly. It was a small local assembly in one district in the LA area. And I met with them, and they didn't ask me too many questions. Somebody warned me, you better find out when Mullah Hossein was born. And they met with me, they asked a few questions, and then they said, we're sorry, the house is very small, and the assembly has to meet in private, you know. Would you mind standing in this street while we review your case? I was in the street. It was March. It was cold. And 10 minutes passed, 15 minutes passed, 20 minutes passed. Then the door opened. I thought, boy, they really had a hard time deciding about whether they would let me in. And the chairman said to me, so sorry to keep you waiting so long. He said, the assembly hasn't met for 6 months, and they had some business. They wanted to have the closing prayer with you, and that's why it's taken all this time. Well, that was a relief to me because I thought I wasn't going to get in. All right. Here again we have youthful glory, the irresistible person of the Bob, irresistible in his charm, unsurpassed in his heroism, unrivaled in the dramatic episodes of his swift and tragic ministry. These are things, friends, we can speak about. There's another facet to this which I feel is helpful to us. When you want to describe the shrine, the influence of the 3 shrines in the Holy Land, it's very interesting to think of these characteristics, because the friends have different feelings in the different shrine. You go to the shrine of the Bob, it has a certain dynamic immediacy about it. At least these are personal impressions, but we hear it over and over from the friends. You go to the shrine of Baha'u'llah and you have this serenity and this peace and glory of God there. So this is quite interesting from that point of view. How are we doing on time here? Okay. Now the question of that was the mission, the short mission statement, so to speak. Now we have the question of his ministry. How do we convey? How do we understand? How do we resolve our own understanding of this period of the 8 years, the years of the ministry of the Bob? Again, we go back to this statement that was prepared for the government, for the United Nations survey of religions in the Holy Land. Shoghi Effendi focuses us now on the ministry of the Bab, then he, of course, goes on to the ministry of Baha'u'llah and that of Abdul Baha. The one which we're interested in today is, of course, related to the Bab. I'm doing these a bit in reverse order because I think it's easier to understand them. The other overview is the one from the foreword to God Passes By. The foreword to God Passes By, friends, if you haven't read God Passes By, at least get the foreword and read the foreword, because it's a summary of the whole book of what's going to happen. And it's very helpful to have in mind. With regard to his ministry, this is now in like a single paragraph. Shoghi Effendi takes the whole ministry of the Bab and sets it forth for us. He says, swift and severe persecution launched by the organized forces of church and state in his native land precipitated successively his arrest, his exile to the mountains of Azerbaijan, his imprisonment in the fortresses of Maku and Cherik, and his execution in July 1850 by a firing squad in the public square of Tabriz. No less than 20,000 of his followers were put to death with such barbarous cruelty as to evoke the warm sympathy and the unqualified admiration of a number of Western writers, diplomats, travelers, and scholars, some of whom were witnesses of these abominable outrages and were moved to record them in their books and diaries. That's from the statement to the United Nations Committee. Consider now a parallel one from the foreword to God Passes By. This is the first period he's describing of the 4 that he surveys and characterizes in the whole book of God Passes By. It begins with the declaration of his mission, culminates in his martyrdom, and ends in a veritable orgy of religious massacre, revolting in its hideousness. It's characterized by 9 years of fierce and relentless contest, whose theater was the whole of Persia, in which above 10,000 heroes laid down their lives, in which 2 sovereigns of the Qajar dynasty and their wicked ministers participated, and which was supported by the entire Shia ecclesiastical hierarchy, by the military resources of the state, and by the implacable hostility of the masses. That's about as tight a history as you can get of the period of the Bab. Friends, you know, looking at the Dawnbreakers and these episodes that we want to be remembering leading up to this bicentenary period, Iran was convulsed with the revelation. The revelation had an impact far greater than has been allowed to be recorded in Persian history. They've tried to cleanse it and lessen it and reduce it to nothing. But it was the immediacy of the Bab's mission. You can imagine, there's no, these were societies that lived off of coffee houses. There wasn't a newspaper. There was no, phone in your pocket that you could read the headlines, what's going on. Word of mouth, and you know how stories change from, great were the miracles of the Bab, but even greater was the account of them all over the country. Everybody was listening to everything that was going on. They were hearing it, and all were alert to hear what is the message of the Bab? What is his purpose? And they were so thrilled with all kinds of stories. Now, if you want a fuller overview of the ministry, still not lengthy, but very, very purposeful, you look at the table of contents of God Passes By. Shoghi Effendi there has organized the whole 9-year period into 5 sections, 5 chapters. I want to refer briefly to them here because it'll give you an idea. It will cause you to remember things you should remember. And if you're not familiar with the subject and what it refers to, you will wish to investigate and inform yourself properly, responsibly, if you will. The ministry of the Bab, the birth of the Bab, first part. The birth of the Babi revelation, declaration of the Bab's mission, enrollment of the letters of the living, the Bab's pilgrimage to Mecca, the Bab's arrest and departure for Isfahan. Filled so many episodes, so moving about, you remember the plague in Shiraz after they were going to arrest and detain the Bab and thinking of killing him. The Bab's sojourn in Isfahan and the marvelous events that took place there with the conversion of the governor. The second section is on the Bab's captivity in Azerbaijan, and it includes the significance of his captivity, his incarceration in Maku and Cherik, his examination in Tabriz, where he declared so openly that he was the promised Qaim, remembering that the governor of Azerbaijan at that time was the crown prince who was to become Nasruddin Shah. Nasruddin Shah saw the Bab declare he was the promised Qaim, was sitting in that gathering. His examination, in Tabriz, and the punishment that they meted out to him, his writings, his covenant, and then Shoghi Effendi's review of the conference of Badasht. Then he goes into these upheavals in Mazandaran, which of course was Sheikh Tabarsi, all the events of Sheikh Tabarsi, Neriz, the revolt in Nariz and ending with the martyrdom of Vahid, Zanjan, the last. Just recently, my wife and I have been reading these passages out loud to ourselves in the morning. We have a little devotional, and the extent of the involvement of thousands of people along with Hojat in Zanjan that were resisting the pressures of the government and of the clergy to renounce the faith. It's an amazing spectacle. You must go back and visit that again if you haven't looked at it. And finally, the account of the 7 martyrs of Tehran, which, as you recall, included the uncle that raised the Bab himself. The Bab, overcome with grief with the hearing of all these things that happened. Then the section on the execution of the Bab, the events preceding his death, circumstances attending his martyrdom, which have been so beautifully recounted here, the tributes that were paid to his memory, the parallel between his mission and that of Jesus Christ. We'll come back to that a bit later on, too. The significance of his mission. All right, Shoghi Effendi summarizes all these things for us and draws quotations from various sources and the comments of Baha'u'llah himself on these events. Then we have the attempt on the life of the Shah and its consequences. That chapter contains circumstances attending the attack on Nasruddin Shah. What was the background? How was Baha'u'llah's innocence established? Because he was such an important Babi figure, they felt he must be responsible in some way for the attempt on the life of the Shah. Then the massacre of the Babis in Tehran, and it spread to other cities, just merciless. Anybody that there was a whisper of the possibility they could be a Babi was grabbed and killed, and the wives and the children. Friend, there's so many of these things that even in our own time, with the revolution and the persecution of the Baha'is in 1979 on, we don't realize all the little terrible things that happened that aren't news because they weren't executed. For example, the story of the officials entering into the home of a young Baha'i family and humiliating the wife in front of the husband and taking from her hands the baby in her arms over to the samovar and sticking the mouth of the baby on the samovar and opening the boiling water in the face of the parents. I mean, that's not international news, but think of the implications of that. An old man who can't buy any food because he's a Baha'i in one village, so he walks at great pain to himself to another village. And when the village ruffians realize that he's a Baha'i from another village, they go to him and they put out their cigarettes in his eyes. This is modern times. We were hearing this as serving in the Holy Land. The friends have been through miserable times. You hear about persecutions, but when it comes down to the individual events, it becomes very, very heartrending. I remember Mr. Olinga was visiting Buenos Aires in South America, and he was saying he'd been with the Guardian. He was describing his pilgrimage, and he mentioned that the question had arisen, why Nasruddin Shah escaped punishment? All the other officials and people who were involved in the persecution suffered dire consequences, and he didn't. He lived on, and his reign was 50 years as Shah. And what he said, the Guardian said, was that it was a mercy, a compassion to Nasruddin Shah because of what the Babis had done to him. that God prolonged his time here. Until his golden jubilee, on the 50th anniversary of his reign, he was shot at the mosque and died as a consequence. And Shoghi Effendi, now consider we were speaking, I was translating to Spanish for the Hand of the Cause, and the audience was mostly former Catholics and some of the older Catholic ladies, very sensitive to the question that came up next, because Shoghi Effendi said, and when Nasruddin Shah died, he went straight to hell. One of the older ladies started fanning herself in the back of the room, and then I thought, this is getting a bit delicate, but let's hear what happens next. So I turned to Mr. Olinga, and he said, and then the Guardian said, and he's still there. At which point, the lady who was fanning herself fainted off her chair. The visions of childhood, brainwashing about hell, going to hell, and what's going to happen to you. And the Baha'is, who were more than happy to say, well, hell is, it's not really real. It's not a physical hell with real physical fire. It's worse than that, I'm sorry to say, but we don't like to think about it. Anyway, that was interesting. I also heard something, this is anecdotal completely. Rhea Khanum said that when she was, after her marriage, one time Shoghi Effendi was jesting with her, and he said, Nasruddin Shah went to hell. And he said, when Muhammad Ali, the archbreaker of Baha'u'llah's covenant, he died, he went to hell too. And then Nasruddin Shah was complaining. He says, where am I to go? Where am I to go? You expect me to live here with this Muhammad Ali? Crazy. Now, summary a vision, if you will, of what was the Bab's position from the words of Baha'u'llah. Now you can imagine, there are endless tablets and references to this, but out of all those, our beloved Guardian, who surveys with this divine infallible vision of the cause of God, he chooses certain titles and characteristics to impress upon us how Baha'u'llah views the Bab. Shoghi Effendi writes, he says, the Bab, acclaimed by Baha'u'llah as the essence of essences, the sea of seas. Two very interesting titles. These are referred to also in the dispensation, if you're aware of it. As the point round whom the realities of the prophets and messengers revolve, whose rank excelleth that of all the prophets, and whose revelation transcendeth the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones. We're familiar with the phrase about the king of the messengers of God in the tablet of Ahmad with reference to the Bab. There is a hierarchy among the prophets of God. And to think of the Bab simply in the terms of being a herald of Baha'u'llah and not really having a full role of prophecy is a mistake. His mission outranks the mission of all the previous manifestations of God. We counted the words of revelation that we had access to. Baha'u'llah had left a box of the writings of the Bab to Abdul Baha, and passed on to the Guardian and to the House of Justice. And now they've all been cataloged and they've all been digitized. So can you imagine how many of the words of the Bab, of revelation we have from the Bab. They summarized 5 million single words, That is greater than the combined scriptures of all the known religions of the past. He alone has equaled all the previous revelations and then gone beyond that. I'll come to what Baha'u'llah did in another session with you. So these are 6 references from the Bab that are also cited in God Passes By. You know about the titles of the primal point, the comparing of this point round whom the realities of prophets and messengers revolve has been extended to the shrine of the Bab as well. Shoghi Effendi mentions that. Continuing on with the theme of the writings of the Bab, if we're asked about the writings of the Bab, mostly we have previously known about the history of the Bab, episodes in his ministry and so on, and with some reference to his writings, but not usually to the content of his writings. For those of you who are interested, the House of Justice encouraged Nader Saidi to incorporate his studies of the texts of the Bab in a scholarly book which is called Gate of the Heart. And there you can find all kinds of references to the content of his independent revelation, really. The first 3 years were about the deep spiritual meanings of everything to do with spirituality and religion. One of his writings, the best known, characterized by Baha'u'llah as the most important, was the Qayyum al-Asma. And we've heard the counselor refer this morning to the revelation of the commentary on the Surah of Joseph. And that's the title of that is the Qayyum al-Asma. And it began on the very first night of his declaration. He revealed the first chapter in the presence of Mullah Hussein. This summary of that book again, and you go to God Passes By, you find everything that you need. He's summarized in a full, long paragraph the nature, contents of the Qayyum al-Asma. Probably obviously you're aware of the Persian Bayan. This is the book of laws of the Bab revealed in Maku during the Bab's imprisonment in Maku. Shoghi Effendi, commenting on the writings, says, alike in the magnitude of the writings emanating from his pen, and in the diversity of the subjects treated in his writings, his revelation stands wholly unparalleled in the annals of any previous religion. That's quite a statement. In a paragraph, he says, no less arresting is the variety of themes presented by these voluminous writings, such as prayers, homilies, orations, tablets of visitation, scientific treatises, doctrinal dissertations, exhortations, commentaries on the Quran and on various traditions, epistles to the highest religious and ecclesiastical dignitaries of the realm, and laws and ordinances for the consolidation of his faith and the direction of its activities. There's a work of the Bab called Panshan, which means 5 modes. Mode in the sense of a category of revelation. And the Bab
describes, he repeats 4 modes of revelation which existed in the Islamic dispensation, and then 1 new mode that he adds himself. And just briefly summarizes just the mention of this again, it teases you to go and study further into the writings of the Bab and understand about them as part of your overall survey and understanding of the dispensation of Baha'u'llah. He said the first mode of revelation are the divine verses, the ayat, the verses that come from God, and they're voiced in the voice of God. Remember, Baha'u'llah was challenged. He said he is claimed to be God, and he explains in the Kitab-i-Gan that when the manifestation of God claims to speak in the voice of God, when he says, I am God, verily, verily, I am God, this is the essence of self-effacement of the manifestation. He has so removed his person that God speaks through him in the first person. I am God. It's a very interesting concept. Now, this mode of revelation is characterized by the phrase, I am God. The second mode of revelation, he says, are prayers. And this corresponds somewhat to the inner state of the Bab, that he was the source of revelation and divinity. And then the person of the Bab, in which he assumes, as Baha'u'llah does in some of his tablets and writings, that he's less than anyone. He's submissive entirely to the will of God. So you have the station of revelation, and then you have the individual soul of the manifestation, which always manifests this terrific meekness and humbleness. The second stage, he said, has to do with prayers and praise of the first mode of revelation. Prayers referring to the first stage of revelation, the first mode of revelation. And that is characterized by the phrase, Thou art God. The third mode of revelation are commentaries upon the first and the second modes, in which the mode of revelation, he said, is He is God. Descriptions, commentaries on the content of the first stage. And the fourth stage, he said, are scientific treatises and other dissertations of the manifestation on a great variety of things. He is God who does this and explains that and so on. Then the Bab says, I have brought a fifth mode of revelation, and that's the mode of all the previous 4 stages, but this time in the Persian language, in Farsi. And those are the 5 he mentioned. Baha'u'llah, when he revealed the tablet, the Surat al-Haykal, where he describes the relationship of his manifestation with the divinity, he says that he is revealed within the Haykal, which includes the composite Haykal, which includes the tablets to the kings and rulers, 9 modes of revelation. We don't have a confirmation of exactly what those 9 modes are, but again, Shoghi Effendi lists, as I read to you, the variety of themes presented in the writings of the Bab. He does that also for Baha'u'llah, and you can see that the modes are really endless. And Baha'u'llah says himself, he said, we could reveal in many more modes if it were needed. So, something of the writings of the Bab. Interesting, he says, it was during the Bab's incarceration in the fortress of Marku that he, according to the testimony of Sheikh Hassani Sanusi, who transcribed during those 9 months the verses dictated by the Bab to his amanuensis, that the Bab revealed no less than 9 commentaries on the whole of the Quran. Shoghi Effendi highlights that in the Bayan, in the 3rd Vahed, in the 3rd section of the Bayan, An explicit reference is made to the name of the promised one, and in anticipation of the order which in a later age was to be identified with his revelation. He states that this deserves to rank as one of the most significant statements recorded in any of the Bab's writing, and I'll quote it for you here from the Persian Bayan. Well is it with him who fixeth his gaze upon the order of Baha'u'llah, and rendereth thanks unto his Lord, for he will assuredly be made manifest. God hath indeed irrevocably ordained it in the Bayan. Now, friends, at this time, Baha'u'llah was not known as Baha'u'llah. There's this reference to the order of Baha'u'llah. And Shoghi Effendi identifies this with the world order, the references to the transforming, vibrating influence of Baha'u'llah's new world order in the Aqdas. And you will recall that after the proceedings, the time of the conference of Badakhsh, the Bab gave titles to the various letters of the living and addressed Mirza Hossein Ali as Baha'u'llah. So there's this identity with those words, and then you'll remember that one of the treasures of the Bab period is a derivation of 360, I think, derivations from the Arabic word Baha in his exquisite handwriting of the Bab. I don't know if you've seen examples of the Bab's handwriting. It's extraordinary. It's so small and so beautiful. So this is just a slight reference here then to his writings in general. Continuing on with our theme of the rank and station of the Bab, further words of the guardian for our edification and guidance. It says, dearly beloved friends, that the Bab, the inaugurator of the Babi dispensation, is fully entitled to rank as one of the self-sufficient manifestations of God. Self-sufficient manifestation is also sometimes termed in the writings manifestation endowed with constancy. It means he brings a book and his own set of laws, and that those laws then reign. Other manifestations may appear afterwards and write commentaries or explanations of his writing, but these are the self-sufficient manifestations of God. He's been, as such, he's been invested with sovereign power and authority and exercises all the rights and prerogatives of independent prophethood. This is yet another fundamental verity which the message of Baha'u'llah insistently proclaims and which its followers must uncompromisingly uphold. That he is not to be regarded merely as an inspired precursor of the Baha'i revelation. That in his person, as he himself bears witness in the Persian Bayan, the object of all the prophets gone before him has been fulfilled. This is a truth which I feel my duty to demonstrate and emphasize, the guardian said. We would assuredly be failing in our duty to the faith we profess, and would be violating one of its basic and sacred principles if in our words or by our conduct we hesitate to recognize the implications of this root principle of Baha'i belief, or refuse to uphold unreservedly its integrity and demonstrate its truth. And it's at this point in the explanation of Shoghi Effendi in this World Order letter, he makes reference to the motives that caused him to bring forth the Dawnbreakers, the book of the Dawnbreakers, he says this. He says, indeed, the chief motive actuating me to undertake the task of editing and translating Nabil's immortal narrative has been to enable every follower of the faith in the West to better understand and more readily grasp the tremendous implications of his exalted station, and to more ardently admire and love him. You know, Nabil had collected some of these stories. He himself testifies that he interviewed as many people as he could during trips that he made to Iran after the Babi period. Those were involved in Sheikh Tabarsi and in some of the revolts that were described, Neriz, Tehran, Neriz, and Zanjan. And Baha'u'llah, at one point, I think it was 1888, he said to Nabil that it was time for him to compose a book of his experiences and the accounts that he'd seen and heard of. And he kind of put him to the test. He said that I want you to come every Wednesday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and present me with a fascicle of so many pages. And week after week, he was waiting for that. And Nabil dedicated himself. He had to put all of his attention on that. And Mirza Musa helped him a lot in this, Baha'u'llah's brother. And he presented these, and then Aga Jan would read passages from them to Baha'u'llah, and eventually Baha'u'llah answers in 2 tablets to Nabil certain suggestions and changes that he needs to create for Nabil's narrative. So it was directly under the supervision of Baha'u'llah that Nabil's narrative was created by Nabil. And later in the time of Abdul Baha, he had some comments and views of his own, and finally Shoghi Effendi edits the whole thing for an English version. That is what we have. But a work of love he gave us, a work of sacrifice. Now, the time passes, and sometimes we're not always familiar with some of the letters of the Guardian about Nabil's narrative. I want to quote a few passages here to you to incentivize all of us that we return and read this book now ourselves. Shoghi Effendi writes, this is from a letter written on his behalf, I would strongly urge you to utilize to the utmost possible extent the wealth of authentic material gathered in Nabil's stirring narrative, and to encourage the youth to master and digest the facts recorded therein as a basis for their future work in the teaching field and as a sustenance to their spiritual life and activities in the service of the cause. What a terrific emphasis. So all you youth out there, master and digest the facts of the Dawnbreakers is the challenge that you have before you. Don't stop these other activities that are going on to do that. This is a separate level of individual study of the writings which we need to keep on with. There's some hours of the day we can't do the collective activities, and those hours, let us fill them with a review and study of these basic memories and that the house is highlighting for us. Again, Shoghi Effendi in a letter said, no one can read the Dawnbreakers and remain cold and unreceptive. The deeds of those heroic souls are bound to stir the reader and win his support. Who can see what they experienced in the path of God? Who can see what they've experienced in the path of God and remain apathetic? Again, He was deeply gratified to learn that the reading of the Dawnbreakers has deepened your knowledge of the cause and has inflamed you with new courage and faith. The tale of these immortal heroes of God, so well narrated by the powerful pen of Nabil, is indeed stimulating and spiritually uplifting. It gives the reader a new vision of the cause and unfolds before his eyes the glory of this new manifestation in a manner hitherto unknown. Nabil's narrative is not merely a narrative. It is a book of meditation. Interesting. It does not only teach, it actually inspires and incites to action. It quickens and stimulates our dormant energies and makes us soar on a higher plane. It is thus of an invaluable help to the historian as well as to every teacher and expounder of the cause. Glorious letter. This is quoted in Shoghi Effendi, The Range and Power of His Pen, which is a book written by Ali Nakhchavani and published out of Italy. That's the only place that letter appears so far. Shoghi Effendi says he fully approves the idea of holding study classes for the deepening of the friends. The deeper the friends go in their understanding of their teachings, the more firm and steadfast they will become, and the more unwavering in their support of the institutions of the faith. And if I'm allowed to add a few words here, and the plans of the institutions of the faith, because they need our support. Books such as the Agon, Some Answered Questions, and the Dawnbreakers should be mastered by every Baha'i. They should read these books over and over again. The last book will show you how the faith was ushered into the world and how its early adherents heroically faced martyrdom and suffering in their desire to establish the cause throughout the world. Knowing the life of these heroes will create in us the urge to follow their footsteps and achieve the same. Friends, we're really standing on the shoulder of these terrific heroes. And you know, I think it was to Martha Root, she reports that the Guardian said that not all the heroes of the faith are saints. People had their shortcomings, but they still were heroic and they died as martyrs. But Shoghi Effendi adds, he said, but all the saints are heroes. If you attain to sanctity and detachment in the cause of God, that's a heroic act in itself and has a great influence on everyone around us if we can manage that. I think we've come to the end of the session, and this hopefully significant review of the writings from the Guardians, the words of the Guardian himself. And I hope you'll go and find these characterizations of the Bab, the person of the Bab, and use them in your teaching leading up and your understanding leading up to the commemoration of the bicentenary of his birth. Thank you. Shoghi Effendi writes, he says, wishing to stress the sublimity of the Bab's exalted station as compared with that of the prophets of the past, Baha'u'llah in the Igan asserts, no understanding can grasp the nature of his revelation, nor can any knowledge comprehend the full measure of his faith. My goodness. He then quotes in confirmation of his argument the prophetic words from Islam. This is the quotation. Knowledge is 27 letters. Knowledge is 27 letters. All that the prophets have revealed are 2 letters thereof. No man thus far hath known more than these 2 letters. But when the Qaim shall arise, he will cause the remaining 25 letters to be made manifest. Baha'u'llah then adds, behold how great and lofty is his station. His rank excelleth that of all the prophets, and his revelation transcendeth the comprehension and understanding of all their chosen ones. He further adds, of his revelation, of the Bab's revelation, the prophets of God, his saints and chosen ones, have either not been informed, or in pursuance of God's inscrutable decree, they have not disclosed. Baha'u'llah, also in the Igan, and this is a very interesting, I was talking yesterday about Mr. Qadem's pilgrimage. One of the Afnan ladies who had inherited the original Igan that was written to the uncle of the Bab had this manuscript in hand. And on the visit of Janabi Samandari to Shiraz, she presented it to him to give to the guardian so that he would have the original in the hand of Abdul Baha to send to the Holy Land. And Mr. Samandari sent it to the National Assembly. They advised the guardian. The guardian said, do not send this in the mail, it's too wait. We will wait for a trustworthy person to bring it in the future. And when Janabi Qadem had applied for pilgrimage, the guardian instructed the NSA to give him the copy of the Igan to bring to his presence. Dr. Chukari was in the Holy Land at the table of the guardian. He was a liaison member of the International Baha'i Council, living abroad, was already, of course, a hand of the cause, in touch with the guardian on a regular basis. He said that evening the guardian brought the Igan to the pilgrim table, and he opened the bokche, the fancy silk it was enwrapped in, and showed us the Igan. The Igan's about the size of a hand. It's not big, but it's fairly thick. It's written in this beautiful handwriting of Abdul Baha. In the margins, Shoghi Effendi had pointed out to Dr. Chukari and the other pilgrims that were there, Baha'u'llah in his own hand has added a few notes here and there and corrected something, changed something slightly. And the largest amendment to the Igan is a passage in the margin that he's added in his own hand, in Baha'u'llah's own hand. And I'm going to quote that to you now. And Shoghi Effendi was so thrilled to see that that was in Baha'u'llah's own hand. He said he had the copy of the Igan, but not with showing which were the editions. It was an Egyptian edition of the Igan that he used, a copy that Zayn had made, but it didn't include showing changes, it just put the final copy. And he said, I had chosen a verse from that to adorn the title page of Nabil's narrative. And how delighted I was to see that this was in Baha'u'llah's own hand in the margin of the Igan. Amidst them all, Baha'u'llah wrote, we stand in hand, life in hand, wholly resigned to his will, that perchance through God's loving kindness and grace, this revealed and manifest letter, referring to himself, may lay down his life as a sacrifice in the path of the primal point, the most exalted word. Shoghi Effendi has added in parenthesis, the Bab, the most exalted word. By him at whose bidding the Spirit hath spoken. But for this yearning of our soul, we would not for one moment have tarried any longer in this city. This is the city being Baghdad, where the revelation of the Igan took place in the most great house. Shoghi Effendi in the dispensation, after quoting this, he says, so resounding a praise, so bold an assertion issued by the pen of Baha'u'llah in so weighty a work are fully re-echoed in the language in which the source of the Babi revelation has chosen to clothe the claims he himself has advanced. Friends, the Guardian sent his selection of prayers and meditations to the American Baha'i community for publication in English in his translation some years ago, back in the 30s. And he said to the friends in a message, he said he hoped that this book alone, Prayers and Meditations by Baha'u'llah, would enable the friends to draw nigh unto Baha'u'llah, that he might draw nigh unto them. And I think these characteristic passages of the Bab about his own station enable us to draw nigh unto him, that he might draw nigh unto us. If the prophets of God, the manifestations of God, didn't announce to us who they were, how would we know who they were? Who could tell us who they were? Some people have said there that it seems immodest that they say they're the messenger of God and that they've been sent by God. But if they don't tell us who they are, how would we know? Baha'u'llah so himself announcing in the Haikal and later also in his tablets, where he speaks about his experience in the Siyad Chal and so on. And he describes how the Maid of Heaven points to him and announces him as the best beloved. And Shoghi Effendi calls that a personation of his own spirit. The angel is Baha'u'llah's own spirit that has taken the form of a maiden and made this announcement in a way that's modest compared to if he said, and verily, verily, I am the best beloved, although he says that later quite boldly himself in the Aktas. But for the opening description, he has this feminine figure announce his revelation and his station. Quite interesting to consider these short phrases that are there announcing who the Bab considers himself to be, who Baha'u'llah considers the Bab to be. How better could we approach and enhance our understanding and communion with the spirit of the Bab? I am the mystic fane, the Bab thus proclaims in the Qayyum al-Asma, which the hand of omnipotence hath reared. I am the lamp which the finger of God hath lit within its niche and caused to shine with deathless splendor. I am the flame of that supernal light that glowed upon Sinai in the gladsome spot and lay concealed in the midst of the burning bush. Should it be our wish, the Bab again confirms, it is in our power to compel through the agency of but one letter of our revelation, the world and all that is therein to recognize in less than the twinkling of an eye the truth of our cause. central to all the revelations of God, central to our own teachings, is the principle of free choice on the part of man. He sets forth his revelations before us. He invites us to recognize him, but it depends on the soul of man whether they recognize or not. He doesn't. He could compel, as he says, in one moment everybody to submit, but he doesn't, because God has given us this possibility of participating in the sharing of the revelation. He invites us, and we have to respond. You people have responded. You've turned with your hearts. You've poured your energies into the faith. You have the full support of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, whose light, as we said yesterday, confirmed by Abdul-Baha, is shining over all the friends. Again, the Bab says, and this time he was addressing Muhammad Shah himself, the king at the time, from Maku, I am the primal point from which have been generated all created things. What statement are we hearing here? The primal will is the cause of the creation of everything. Do you recall in the Lohe Hekmat, in the Tablet of Wisdom, Baha'u'llah states that creation is constantly being recreated. At every instant, God causes the world to be recreated. He is involved with us in maintaining us in our breath, in giving life to our thoughts and existence at every instant. So quickly is the repetition that we see it as a sequence. Extraordinary. In case you thought that he prepared this banquet for us and then went on a holiday or something. God doesn't go away. He's there constantly at the door of the heart, waiting to see who's going to respond. Abdu'l-Baha says that as the soul rules and directs all the functions of the body, we think the body is independent of the soul. It exists solely because of the soul. As soon as the soul lifts off of the body, its influence is projected into the body. It lifts off the body comes apart, starts immediately decaying and corrupting. In the same way, he said that we are aware of the cells of our body, and we're immediately have conscious knowledge of everything that happens in our body. Nobody has to tell us, are you hot or are you cold? Or these are things we have, that kind of knowledge that Abdu'l-Baha describes as immediate, intuitive knowledge. The manifestation of God at his level has all of the human race as the cells of his inner being. So he is in touch with the spiritual reality of all of us at every moment. Why is it that you can pray and he answers you, and this fellow over here can do it at the same time, and it doesn't seem to cause any difficulty for God through the manifestation of God, because he's ordained that through this manifestation of God we should approach him and pray to him. We can pray directly to God, but Shoghi Effendi queries why we would do that when we have the very channel of God present amongst us to direct ourselves to the light of God coming through them. I am the countenance of God, whose splendor can never be obscured, the light of God, whose radiance can never fade. All the keys of heaven God hath chosen to place on my right hand, and all the keys of hell on my left. I am one of the sustaining pillars of the primal word of God. Whoever hath recognized me hath known all that is true and right, and hath attained all that is good and seemly. The substance wherewith God hath created me is not the clay out of which others have been formed. He hath conferred upon me that which the worldly wise can never comprehend, nor the faithful discover. To finish this review of the rank and position to the degree that we could comprehend it. I want to quote from the Will and Testament of Abdu'l-Baha, the repository of his last wishes and parting instructions. In a passage which Shoghi Effendi says has been specifically designed to set forth the guiding principles of Baha'i belief, we find these words, and he says they set the seal of his testimony on the Bab's dual and exalted station. Remember, we're talking again twofold station of the Bab. Those of you, maybe some of you weren't here yesterday, on the one hand he's the herald of the glory of God that's about to appear, but on the other hand he is an independent manifestation of God, the king of God's messengers. His title is from Baha'u'llah. What a position he has, friends. Abdu'l-Baha writes, the foundation of the belief of the people of Baha, may my life be offered up for them, is this. His Holiness the Exalted One is the manifestation of the unity and oneness of God, and the forerunner of the ancient beauty. His Holiness the Abha Beauty, of course this is Baha'u'llah, may my life be offered up as a sacrifice for his steadfast friends, is the supreme manifestation of God and the dayspring of his most divine essence. Then Abdu'l-Baha adds significantly, all others are servants unto him and do his bidding. I wanted to conclude this section reading you a statement from Shoghi Effendi in the light of the things that we're hearing about, the magnitude of the range of the position of the Bab and subsequently of Baha'u'llah. Do we realize, friends, what a privileged position we are in with respect to human history itself? Perhaps we might have been born closer to one of the previous manifestations of God, but how can that compare to having been born in the cycle inaugurated by the King of the messengers of God? Our recognition may be preliminary, partial in some ways, but as we continually, in our devotions, in our prayers, in our service, in our sacrifice, the dawning light of the Bab and Baha'u'llah increases in our soul. And that light becomes manifest in our faces. And that light communicates to the people that we speak to and meet. And it piques their curiosity. Sometimes they recognize immediately, sometimes the words that we say are like seeds. The name of Baha'u'llah, the name Baha'i, has a special place inside the soul that locks in when they hear it the first time. Shoghi Effendi says it goes into the subconscious and continues to act on the life of the person who might be entirely unaware of it, and eventually can produce changes in their lives. These are these seeds that we're planting everywhere as we teach and propagate the faith. Shoghi Effendi says, if the friends only realized there's only a few times in history when opportunities for mortal glory come to a people, and that time is now in their hands. We are the children at the formative age of the faith. We're involved in laying the foundations of the kingdom of God in so many ways that we don't even understand. But through obedience and submission, we carry out our mission. It's so important that we realize how much we need to dedicate our lives to spreading the cause, how there's nothing more important at all in our lives, and how to the degree that we sacrifice, we attract divine confirmations, and how those confirmations are the unique source of attracting souls to the faith. If we teach the faith and people say, I'm not interested, or they don't show any interest, the problem is generally, friends, not the people we're talking to. It's our problem, that we are not shining enough with the faith that they would be awakened by it. And we constantly have to beg and submit ourselves to the holy threshold. Assist me to be confirmed. Assist me that my light might touch the hearts of others as you've commanded me to do. Any other activity, friends, is totally secondary compared to that because of the time we live in. Think of one of the architects working with the architect of the Chile temple, a Chilean woman. While she was working on the drawings in Canada, they needed to be stamped by the Chilean law and so on. She had several dreams of Baha'u'llah. She's a non-Baha'i. When we heard this, we said, why doesn't Baha'u'llah come and tell us these things? Why does he tell us? And she said, he came to me and he said that you must devote your life to this temple, building this temple. It's so important. He said, you will see within 500 years, all the people of South America will be Baha'is. Now, friends, who are we going to teach? If we were born in that time, who would we teach? You see why the privilege is ours, because we still can find souls that haven't heard of the cause. We can still be the first ones to communicate it. There's a tablet from Abdul Baha. He says, the service of the friends belongs to God, not to them. Because anything that you imagine to do that's good has come from God. Think of the verses in the Gleanings. There's a tablet. He says, all good comes from God, and all evil comes from your own selves. Well, pretty clear explanation. It's a little strong to flip it, but I like to flip it because it makes us think. No evil comes from God. Everything God does is good. And no good comes from man. Everything he has is evil. We have to replace the evil, which is full of pride and passion and self-importance, with this confirmations of God. He says, empty yourself and you'll become a channel, and I'll use you to conquer the masses of the world. Have you tasted of that? We heard last night, if the pioneering, if you just get the flavor of pioneering, you never want to stop doing it. And teaching is the same way, because we're all pioneers, even if it's a local activity that we're involved in. We should try to turn up the fire in ourselves. Shoghi Effendi said the friends should constantly be asking Baha'u'llah to guide them to receptive souls. Do you daily ask Baha'u'llah, Baha'u'llah, give me an opportunity today to give the cause to somebody else? If the friends realized this time in history that they're living, they would not for a moment busy themselves with idle conversation and gossip, but would sacrifice their all for the quickening of the people and the salvation of society. Life is a constant interchange, Shoghi Effendi said, it should be for each of the Baha'is to study and to teach. Study and teach. He said the Baha'i never reaches a time in their life when they shouldn't be studying the faith. Because through teaching those actions, you have acquired confirmations, the confirmations of the Holy Spirit. They expand consciousness. They enable us to see in words that we read previously, even last week, never mind 10 years ago. They open our eyes to new levels and dimensions. The same words are speaking to all the Baha'is at different levels of capacity. they address the needs that we have so that we can become full of sacrifice and draw nigh unto the Bab and Baha'u'llah in the process. One of the interesting parallels that Shoghi Effendi makes after describing the martyrdom of the Bab and the worldwide effects of his ministry and sacrifice, he draws a parallel with the life and acts of Christ, of Jesus Christ. I just wanted to present that to you briefly here. You can find it in God Passes By in the chapter on the martyrdom of the Bab. Shoghi Effendi explains, "It would indeed be no exaggeration to say that nowhere in the whole compass of the world's religious history, except in the Gospels, do we find any record relating to the death of any of the religion founders of the past comparable to the martyrdom suffered by the Prophet of Shiraz." That's his opening here. So strange, so inexplicable a phenomenon, attested by eyewitnesses, corroborated by men of recognized standing, and acknowledged by government as well as unofficial historians among the people who had sworn undying hostility to the Babi faith, may be truly regarded as the most marvelous manifestation of the unique potentialities with which a dispensation promised by all the dispensations of the past had been endowed. And of course, this is a reference to the miraculous volleys that didn't touch the Bab and his disciple, Anis. The enemies of the faith saw this with their own eyes. Everybody saw it. Government officials, the consular services in Tabriz, they were present and saw these things and wrote about them. The passion of Jesus Christ, and indeed his whole public ministry alone, offer a parallel to the mission and death of the Bab, a parallel which no student of comparative religion can fail to perceive or ignore. And then he lists the points of similarity. In the youthfulness and meekness of the inaugurator of the Babi dispensation, in the extreme brevity and turbulence of his public ministry, in the dramatic swiftness with which that ministry moved towards its climax, in the apostolic order which he instituted and the primacy which he conferred on one of its members. Now, those of you who are familiar with Christian scriptures remember that Peter was appointed by Christ. He was called the rock upon which the faith of Christ would be established. So each one of these you need to know a little about Christianity, but you can find this again in God Passes By and look at the comparison. In the boldness of his challenge to the time-honored conventions, rites, and laws which had been woven into the fabric of the religion he himself had been born into. In the role which an officially recognized and firmly entrenched religious hierarchy played as chief instigator of the outrages which he was made to suffer. In the indignities heaped upon him, in the suddenness of his arrest, both like in the case of Christ as well, in the interrogation to which he was subjected, in the derision poured and the scourging inflicted upon him, in the public affront that he sustained, and finally, in his ignominious suspension before the gaze of a hostile multitude. Christ on the cross, the Bab on the walls of the military barracks. In all these, we cannot fail to discern a remarkable similarity to the distinguishing features of the career of Jesus Christ.
What was the outcome, friends, of the Bob's ministry? I wanted to cite, let's see if we have here. You know, Baha'u'llah has so clearly stated that the Bab, with his coming, has released those energies which will quicken mankind and lead it to its maturity. And its maturity is the fruition of his ministry connected with that of Baha'u'llah. But it starts with the Bab. And Baha'u'llah says these energies will move us toward the kingdom of God on earth. I read last year a note from the diary of Keith Ransom Kaler. Keith Ransom Kaler was a pilgrim in the presence of the Guardian and had been chosen by him to go to Iran in defense of the cause, to champion the cause. She was a college graduate, a very brilliant woman, a wonderful speaker. And Shoghi Effendi mentored her for 4 months in the Holy Land before he sent her to Iran. And she's kept notes of things that he told her. He says this startling thing to her which she can hardly believe her ears when she hears. He asks her, "Do you think, Mrs. Kaler, that the coming of the kingdom of God on earth depends on the actions of the Baha'is?" "Not at all." She's totally startled. She said, "You know, we're constantly being encouraged and told to move forward and help build the kingdom and so on." She said, "Well, if that doesn't do it, then why are we doing it?" He says, "You're doing it for you, not for him. It's going to come about whether you participate or not. But if you participate, you get to share in the glory of the whole affair." That results in the fact that teaching the cause of God, as Abdu'l-Baha says in the Will and Testament, which may appear mysterious to us, he said it's the greatest gift of God. In the past, teaching religion was limited to certain groups in society, to clergy, to those who were recognized as learned in religious matters. Whereas today, he said it's the duty of every Baha'i to proclaim the cause of God. Though the action of proclaiming the cause of God, proclaiming the position of the Bab and Baha'u'llah, in a sacrificial manner, that is, in a manner that's not always comfortable to us, but requires sacrifice. Sacrifice of our time, sacrifice of our funds, sacrifice of our life goals. That, he said, to the degree that we sacrifice, attracts divine confirmations. Divine confirmations cause the soul of man to develop and grow. Abdu'l-Baha says, you stop teaching the cause, the confirmations are cut off. If the confirmations are cut off, your spiritual growth stops. So he's giving us a formula. He's saying, you know, be constantly engaged in teaching the faith. Think about it 24 hours a day. Think about new souls that could hear the sublimity of God's proclamation from your mouths, that you might be the means of passing the spark and light that's in your own heart to their hearts, and therefore receive the confirmation, both of the light of Baha'u'llah and the light of the Bab. What's been the outcome? I want to share with you one sentence from Retrospect and Prospect, the last chapter of God Passes By. In one sentence, Shoghi Effendi surveys the effect from the time of the Shaykhi school
all the way to this world community that's been generated by this process. This process which was energized through the life and sacrifice of the Bab. The outcome. A handful of students belonging to the Shaykhi school, sprung from the Isna Ashariya sect of Shia Islam. Well, that sounds very difficult. Isna Ashariya, maybe you know, it means 12, the 12ers, those that believed in 12 imams, because there's some that believe in 5 and some believe in 7. We are the inheritors of the 12, belief in the 12 imams. So this handful of students, sprung from the Isna Ashariya sect of Shia Islam, had, in consequence of the operation of this process, been expanded and transformed into a world community. Then he describes, characterizes the community in all these short phrases. He said, it's closely knit, it's clear of vision, alive, consecrated by the sacrifice of no less than 20,000 martyrs. Supranational, above nations, above nationhood. Non-sectarian, non-political, claiming the status and assuming the functions of a world religion, spread over 5 continents and the islands of the seas. Now, he's giving statistics here of 1944. You can hear them, but think of where we are now, you know, with 180 national assemblies and so on. With ramifications extending over 60 sovereign states and 17 dependencies. Equipped with a literature translated and broadcast in 40 languages. Now it's over 800. Exercising control over endowments representing several $1 million, or just hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars in endowments that we have all over the world. Recognized by a number of governments in both the East and the West. What a change from this handful of students that went out to discover the Bab. Integral in aim and outlook, possessing no professional clergy, professing a single belief, following a single law, animated by a single purpose, organically united through an administrative order, divinely ordained and unique in its features, including within its orbit representatives of all the leading religions of the world, of various classes and races, which this gathering is certainly representative of. Faithful to its civic obligations, faithful to its civil obligations, conscious of its civic responsibilities, as well as of the perils confronting the society of which it forms a part, sharing the sufferings of that society, and confident of its own high destiny. Full stop. That was one sentence. Shuri Effendi, what a writer. My wife's mother read a paragraph of Tua Shoghi Effendi when she first met Baha'is, and she said, it's finished. No one can write English like this unless they're inspired by God. I believe in this. Just immediately. She ended up pioneering in Honduras for 25 years. The subsequent pilgrim pioneers that went there and traveled around the country, they would go to these very remote areas feeling proud of themselves, and they'd say, we're Baha'is. And they'd say, oh, how is Juanita? Because she'd been there before on horseback or donkey back. I don't know. Amazing lady. Now, I wanted to move from that to a message of the Guardian that was written in July of 1950. So you can imagine what kind of a message this was. It was 100 years after the martyrdom of the Bab. And he was highlighting the sacredness of that occasion. But in the process, he gives us insight into the influence, the extension of these energies of the Bab, released by the Bab, and what they've done in the world. Let's see if we can follow some of this. It will enhance again our vision. It will awaken us and draw us closer to a vision of the Bab appropriate for the coming bicentenary. He addresses it to the assembled representatives of the American Baha'i community gathered beneath the dome of the most holy house of worship in the Baha'i world. Why is the Wilmette, the Chicago Temple, the most holy house of worship in the Baha'i world? He tells us because Abdul-Baha himself laid the cornerstone of that house of worship. Makes it unique. It makes it a shrine. The Sheikh Effendi said it's a shrine as well as a house of worship. And it's the mother house of worship because of that spreads all over the world. He talks about his feelings. He's sharing his feelings of profound emotion evoked by this historic occasion of the worldwide commemoration of the first centenary of the martyrdom of the Blessed Bab. Prophet and herald of the faith of Baha'u'llah. Again, this twofold mission that we've talked about. Founder of the dispensation, the Bab, founder of the dispensation marking the culmination of the 6,000-year-old Adamic cycle. Inaugurator of the 5,000-century Baha'i cycle. Poignantly called to mind the circumstances attending the last act, consummating the tragic ministry of the master hero of the most sublime drama in the religious annals of mankind, signalizing the most dramatic event of the most turbulent period of the heroic age of the Baha'i dispensation. Destined to be recognized by posterity as the most precious, momentous sacrifice in the world's spiritual history. Granted, here he is, the king of the messengers of God, and he gives his life in such a spirit. On the occasion, Sheikh Effendi writes, recall the peerless, this is in Kabylese language, so it's not quite full English. Recall the peerless tributes paid to his memory by the founder of the faith, acclaiming him the monarch of God's messengers, the primal point around whom the realities of all the prophets circle in adoration. My God. Then, profoundly stirred by the memory, and he lists nine points, which if you go back to the message, you can sort out one by one, because you need to think and reflect on what the origin of this phrase is, what's behind this. The agonies he suffered, the glad tidings he announced, the warnings he uttered, the forces he set in motion, the adversaries he converted, the disciples he raised up, the conflagrations he precipitated, the legacy he left of faith and courage, the love he inspired. These are the focus of Sheikh Effendi's attention, and so profoundly stirred, he said, by the memory of these things. Acknowledge with bowed head, joyous, thankful heart, the successive marvelous evidence of his triumphant power in the course of the 100 years elapsed since the last crowning act of his meteoric ministry. He's preparing us to tell us what's been the outcome and effect of the Bab's ministry. Then he goes on, he says, the creative energies released at the hour of the birth of his revelation, endowing mankind with the potentialities of the attainment of maturity. And here it flips, he says, are deranging during the present transitional age the equilibrium of the entire planet as the inevitable prelude to the consummation in world unity of the coming of age of the human race. I don't think we all realize how much the chaos in the world is due to the revelation of the Bab and Baha'u'llah. These energies go forth to establish world unity. If they're met with opposition, they produce chaos. If they're met with acceptance, they have divine confirmation. The Bab says in one place, the verse of God goes out. If the believer receives it, if a soul, a human soul receives it, it is light and blessing to him. If he refuses it, it turns to darkness. So this is what's happened to the world. The proclamation has gone out and we've all done our best. We're trying to do our best anyway, to diffuse it in the world. And it produces reactions of various sorts in individuals and in collectivities, in governments, in movements in the world. All of this is stirring up and breaking down the old world order. A careful study of Shoghi Effendi's writings revealed to what degree the disintegration, the process of disintegration, is related to the energies released by the revelation itself. Read the foreword to God Passes By. It's so clearly stated there. This is also a confirmation of what we were talking about that Keith Ransom Kaler heard from Shoghi Effendi. The energies released have endowed mankind with the potentialities of attaining maturity. There it is. That's the promise. Then he talks about the portentous but unheeded warnings addressed to kings, princes, ecclesiastics are responsible for the successive overthrow of 14 monarchies of East and West, the collapse of the institution of the caliphate, the virtual extinction of the Pope's temporal authority. Temporal authority, he was the ruler of lands as well as the ruler of the church. But all of that through revolution was taken away from him. And this Pope Pius IX, who received the message of Baha'u'llah, to whom the message of Baha'u'llah was addressed, suffered the greatest humiliations. The Italian forces that were in opposition to him marched on the Vatican. He was seen on the steps of St. Peter's on his knees praying to God to stop the attack. And they came and they surrounded, and finally he had to raise a white flag over the Vatican, over St. Peter's, and give over his kingdom to these forces. Virtual extinction of the Pope's temporal authority. He goes on, he says, the progressive decline in the fortunes of the ecclesiastical hierarchies of Islamic, Christian, Jewish, Zoroastrians, and Hindu faiths. Then he mentions the order. He says the order eulogized and announced in his writings. You remember in a previous session we quoted this passage from the Bayan in which it said, well is it with him who reacheth to the order of Baha'u'llah, which was both a prophecy of the coming world order of Baha'u'llah, of which the administrative order is the embryo, and also I don't remember now. This is called senior moment, friends. I presume he'll tell me later, or I'll see it in the text somewhere. Anyway, this order eulogized and announced in his writings, in the Bab's writings, whose laws Baha'u'llah subsequently revealed in the Most Holy Book, whose features Abdul-Baha delineated in his testament, is now passing through its embryonic stage through the emergence of the initial institutions of the world administrative order in the 5 continents of the globe. So this is now 1950, Shoghi Effendi's painting this divine picture for us all. The clarion call sounded in the Qayyum al-Asma, summoning the peoples of the West to forsake their homes and proclaim his message. It's in the very first chapter of the Qayyum al-Asma. Was nobly answered by the communities of the Western Hemisphere, headed by the valorous, stalwart American believers, the chosen vanguard of the all-conquering, irresistibly marching army of the faith in the Western world. The embryonic faith, maturing 3 years after his martyrdom, traversing the period of infancy in the course of the heroic age of the faith, is now steadily progressing towards maturity in the present formative age, destined to attain full stature in the golden age of the Baha'i dispensation. These, of course, 3 ages that we're all familiar with or should become familiar with: the heroic age, the formative age, and the golden age. Lastly, the holy seed of infinite preciousness, holding within itself incalculable potentialities, representing the culmination of the century-old process of the evolution of humanity through the energies released by progressive revelations, starting with Adam and concluded by the revelation of the seal of the prophets. He's painting a picture of something that's coming from the past, right? Marked by the successive appearance of the branches, leaves, buds, blossoms, and plucked after 6 brief years by the hand of destiny, this fruit of the whole earlier process set in motion from Adam, ending now in this perfect fruit. That fruit then, its seed ground in the mill of martyrdom and oppression, produced an oil which flamed up in the heart and being of Baha'u'llah. Look at this progression from the beginning, from Adam right up to the light that comes from Baha'u'llah. In such a setting, the somber, subterranean walls of the Said Shah of Tehran. A flame whose flickering light gathered brilliance in Baghdad and finally shone in full resplendency in its crystal globe in Adrianople, whose rays warmed and illuminated the fringes of the American, European, Australian continents through the tender ministerings of the center of his covenant, whose radiance is now overspreading the surface of the globe during the present formative age. Follow the sequence of the light. It's come from the Bab, then produces this oil that lightened Baha'u'llah, then is proclaimed to the kings. Then Abdul-Baha, through his divine plan, sends out to propagate this light across the surface of the globe, and it reaches all the rest of us at that point. Its full splendor is destined in the course of future millenniums to suffuse the entire planet. I want to stop here for a moment, friends, and direct our attention to 3 words: infuse, diffuse, and suffuse. Infuse was the release of the divine energies by the Bab and Baha'u'llah into the world of human consciousness, into the realm of this earth and its potentialities during the heroic age of the faith. with the latter years of Baha'u'llah's ministry, and more particularly with Abdul Baha and then Shoghi Effendi's ministries, this light was directed by them to be diffused across the whole face of the earth. I was reading the other day a letter of the Guardian to a pioneer couple who'd gone to an island and after some time of sacrifice had to leave the island. And Shoghi Effendi said to them that though they hadn't seen any visible consequence, nobody had accepted the faith on the island, their sacrifice had diffused the light of the revelation over the whole island, and now that light would continue to act there and would bring forth seeds and give its fruition in the future. Friends, this is what we're doing. Sometimes we go with all good feelings to open a place or to give the message of the cause. This is what we're commanded to do. We're not commanded to have victories. That's in His hands. We're commanded to go forth sacrificially and offer the cause. But we have to realize that even as the prayers we say in the privacy of our chamber, there are angels waiting to capture the light of our having repeated these divine words in this realm, in this lower realm, and they diffuse it to the hearts of receptive souls around us. Miraculous things going on. You think you're saying your morning prayers and you're all alone. You're not alone. Hosts of angels are waiting, and they diffuse it and carry it into the neighborhood. I mean, we're talking about neighborhoods. This is a good policy, the repetition of the verses of God, morning and evening. All these efforts, and that's why it somehow helps us to concentrate at times to say these things out loud. Though it's not required to fulfill the law, it is very helpful to help us concentrate, Abdul Baha says. Then, after the diffusion of this light, which has really taken place with the fulfillment of carrying the light of the cause, diffusing the light of God to all the territories mentioned in the divine plan, now we are approaching with a new culture a process of suffusing, letting that light enter into the very life of our communities and transform them. Infusion of the energies, diffusion of the light, penetration and suffusion of that light into the life of the whole of human society. This is the process, I think, that's being referred to here. He elaborates in a few additional paragraphs where he, again, similarly to the passage that I read previously from God Passes By, summarizes how far the faith has gone since the appearance and sacrifice of the Bab. And finally, he at the end appeals to the friends, and through those friends and through that occasion to all of us. I appeal on this solemn occasion, at this anxious hour in the fortunes of this travailing age, to the entire body of the believers, to rededicate themselves and resolve, no matter how great the perils confronting their sister communities on the European, Asiatic, African, and Australian continents, however somber the situation facing both the cradle of the faith and its world center, however grievous the vicissitudes they themselves may eventually suffer, to hold aloft unflinchingly the torch of the faith, impregnated with the blood of innumerable martyrs, and transmit it unimpaired, so that it may add luster to future generations who will labor after them. The Guardian's appeal on a very important centenary, fully applicable, I think, friends, to this commemoration and celebration of the bicentenary of the birth of the Bab that we're approaching.
Thank you.